The president of our HOA told me her computer had been deleting one specific word from the official meeting records for over a year. The word was interim. According to her, every time she tried to type it, the document would automatically remove it. At first, I honestly thought she was trying to be funny, but nobody in the room laughed. And that's when I realized something about this HOA was already off. I had moved into the neighborhood thinking it was just another quiet suburban community. Neatly cut lawns, identical houses, people who mostly kept to themselves. The kind of place where nothing really happens. At least, that's what it looked like from the outside. Inside the HOA, it was something completely different. The first time I attended a meeting, I noticed how controlled everything felt. The chairs arranged in perfect rows inside a small clubhouse, a folding table at the front, a stack of printed documents, and a group of board members acting like they were managing something far more serious than neighborhood rules. There was a tone in the room I didn't understand yet. Not open discussion, more like managed permission to speak. The president ran the meeting like she owned the space. Every question had to go through her. Every clarification was filtered. And when residents spoke, there was always this subtle pressure to wrap it up quickly. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I just assumed that's how HOAs worked. Strict, bureaucratic, a little annoying, nothing unusual. But then I started paying attention to the details. Emails from the board were carefully worded, almost defensive. Rules would be referenced, but not fully explained. Questions were sometimes answered indirectly, or not at all. And whenever someone pushed too hard, the conversation would suddenly shift to respecting the board or following proper procedure. It felt less like community management and more like controlled information. The real problem started when I began reading the bylaws myself. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just trying to understand how decisions were actually made. That's when I found a line that didn't match what I was seeing in real life. It said there was only supposed to be one member at large on the board. One. Not 3, not 5, just one. But in the meetings, I had already seen multiple people sitting in that role, and nobody seemed to question it. So I asked a neighbor about it. She was one of those members at large. Friendly, normal, completely unaware of anything unusual. When I asked how she got the position, she told me something simple. At the end of the annual meeting, they just asked if anyone wanted to volunteer. She raised her hand, and that was it. No election, no formal process, no vote, just agreement in the moment. But later, she told me something that didn't match what the board had been saying. She said at a later meeting, the board approved additional members at large. That didn't make sense with what the bylaw stated. So I checked the latest newsletter, and there it was. 5 members at large listed. 5! When the rules clearly said 1. That's when I emailed the president. I asked a simple question. How are there multiple members at large if the bylaws state only 1? I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I didn't reference other conversations. I just asked for clarification. She didn't answer the question directly. Instead, a few days later, an email went out to the entire neighborhood. And suddenly, my neighbor wasn't listed as a regular member at large anymore. She was now labeled as interim, a term that had never appeared in any document I had seen before. The email defined it like this. Additional at-large members shall be known as interim positions, which are non-voting roles intended for residents who wish to understand how the HOA operates. It sounded official, but it also sounded completely made up, especially because I already knew my neighbor had been voting in meetings, not observing, voting. So I asked her directly, "Do you vote at board meetings?" She said yes. She had voted multiple times, which immediately raised another problem. If she was an interim non-voting member, how was she voting at all? A few days later, the annual meeting arrived. I didn't go there planning anything dramatic. I just wanted answers. But I had prepared. Bylaws printed, notes highlighted, questions ready. Because at that point, something didn't feel like confusion anymore. It felt like inconsistency. And inconsistency usually means something is being hidden. I didn't know it yet, but that meeting would be the first moment the entire system started to crack. And the first time I would hear the explanation that would change everything. That a computer was apparently responsible for deleting words from official records. And that word was interim. I didn't go into the annual meeting planning to expose anything. At that point, I still thought this might all be a misunderstanding. Bad communication, messy administration, maybe even just incompetence. But I was still operating under the assumption that the rules actually meant something. That assumption didn't last long. The meeting room felt exactly like the last one. Folding chairs in rows, a long table at the front, stacks of printed packets nobody fully read, and that same controlled silence that made every conversation feel pre-approved. The HOA president opened the session with the usual tone. Calm, procedural, rehearsed. Everything sounded official. But I had already learned that official didn't always mean accurate. Before the meeting, I had spent hours going through the bylaws again, line by line. Not because I expected to find anything dramatic, but because I wanted to understand how decisions were supposed to work. That's when I saw it, clearly printed in black and white. There shall be one member at large on the board. One. Not a range, not a flexible number, not a depending on participation. Just one. But I had already seen more than one sitting at that table during meetings. So I started doing something I hadn't planned on doing when I moved into a quiet neighborhood. I started tracking names. Who was speaking, who was voting, who was being acknowledged as a board member. And the numbers didn't match. Not even close. I asked one of my neighbors about it before the meeting started. She was one of the people listed as a member at large. She didn't look like someone involved in anything controversial. Just a normal resident who probably thought she was helping out. When I asked how she got the position, she shrugged. She said it happened at the end of the annual meeting. They asked if anyone wanted to volunteer. She raised her hand. No vote, no election, no explanation. Just acceptance in the moment. But then she said something that didn't sit right with me. She mentioned that at a later meeting, the board approved additional members at large. Plural. That immediately contradicted what I had read. One was allowed, not multiple. So I asked her a simple question. Did anyone ever explain what her role actually was? She hesitated, then said, no, not really. And then she added something worse. She said she had voted in multiple board meetings. That stopped me for a second. Because if she was officially a non-voting participant, or just a volunteer observer, then her votes shouldn't have counted at all. But she clearly believed they did, and nobody had told her otherwise. That's when I checked the most recent HOA newsletter. And there it was. 5 members at large listed under the board section. 5! I remember staring at it longer than I should have, because it wasn't just a small inconsistency anymore. It was a direct contradiction of the written bylaws. So I emailed the president. I kept it simple. No accusations, no emotional language, just a question. How are there multiple members at large if the bylaws specify only one? I expected a clarification, maybe even a correction. What I got instead was silence. At first. A few days later, an email went out to the entire neighborhood. Not just to me, to everyone. And suddenly, the language around the board had changed. One of the neighbors I had spoken to was now labeled differently. Not a regular member at large, but an interim member at large. a term I had never seen in any official document before. The email defined it carefully. It explained that additional members at large were interim positions, non-voting roles, intended for residents who wanted to understand how the HOA functioned. It sounded structured, almost reasonable, but something about it felt constructed after the fact, like a justification written to explain something that already happened, not a rule that existed beforehand. So I went back to my neighbor, the one listed as interim. I asked her directly if she knew she was in a non-voting position. She looked confused. She said no one had ever told her that. In fact, she believed she had been voting like everyone else, not observing, not participating in a training role, voting. That created a problem that couldn't be explained away easily. Because now there were only two possibilities. Either she was never supposed to vote, or the board had been treating unofficial roles as official voting positions. Neither option made sense under the bylaws. And the more I thought about it, the worse it got. Because if the structure of the board wasn't being followed correctly, then what else wasn't being followed? At that point, I wasn't trying to accuse anyone of anything. I was just trying to find consistency. But instead of consistency, I kept finding adjustments. Rules that seemed to shift depending on the situation. Rules that appeared after the fact. Definitions that didn't exist until they were needed. And then I saw something else. In the previous year's meeting minutes, the word interim had been handwritten in the margins. Not typed, not formally recorded. Added later, like an edit or a correction, or something retroactively inserted to match a narrative that didn't originally exist. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. This wasn't just confusion. It wasn't just poor communication. It was a system where definitions were being adjusted after decisions were already made. And the most disturbing part wasn't even the contradiction itself. It was how normal everyone else seemed to think it was. Like, none of this required explanation. Like, it was just how things worked. But I couldn't unsee it anymore. One member at large in the bylaws, 5 in practice. A new category created after the fact. And votes that may or may not have been valid depending on who you asked. And sitting in that meeting, listening to the president move through the agenda like everything was perfectly in order, I realized something had already shifted. Not in the rules, but in my understanding of what those rules were actually being used for. Because somewhere between the bylaws and the board meetings, the structure had stopped matching the system, and I still didn't know which one was real. I gathered my papers and stood up to leave, when I noticed something on the front table. A stack of printed minutes from the previous meeting, freshly recopied, redistributed. I picked one up without thinking, and there it was again. The same list of members at large. But this time, next to one of the names, someone had handwritten a small note in the margin. Just one word. Interim. Circled. Twice. And underneath it, a thin line of ink that looked almost like an afterthought. Do not discuss during meeting. No signature, no explanation. Just that. And as I looked up from the page, I noticed something even stranger. Across the room, the HOA president was already watching me. Not speaking, not reacting, just watching. Like she already knew exactly which page I had opened. I didn't say anything when I saw her watching me. I just closed the packet. Slowly, carefully. Like that would somehow make the situation less important than it actually was. But it didn't work. Because once you see something like that, you don't unsee it. The meeting continued as if nothing had happened. Agenda items moved forward, votes were taken, names were called, procedures followed. Everything sounded normal. Too normal. Like the system was actively trying to prove it was still functioning. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was thinking about the note. Do not discuss during meeting. That wasn't language used for clarification. That was language used for control. And then I started noticing something else. Every time the word interim came close to being mentioned, the tone in the room shifted. Not dramatically, subtly. Like people were unconsciously avoiding a specific trigger. That's when the HOA president moved to the next agenda item, and everything changed. She began talking about board structure, membership rules, clarifications, definitions. Her tone was calm, almost instructional. But this time, she was speaking slower than before, carefully choosing her words, like she had prepared for this exact moment. She explained again that certain members at large were interim positions, non-voting roles, educational roles, temporary participation. Each phrase sounded rehearsed. Each sentence felt like it was closing gaps before they could be opened. And then she said it, almost casually, like it had always been true, that interim members were part of the board's internal structure to ensure community engagement and procedural understanding. I looked around the room. Most people were just nodding, accepting it, not questioning it. And that's when something clicked. This wasn't just explanation. This was reframing reality in real time. Because I had already spoken to one of those interim members, and she had no idea she was supposed to be non-voting. None. So I raised my hand. Not aggressively, not emotionally, just directly. And I asked a simple question. Can you clarify something for me? The room went quiet immediately. Not because the question was loud, but because it wasn't expected. I continued. If interim members are non-voting positions, how is it that they've been participating in board votes during previous meetings? The silence after that question felt different, heavier, not awkward, controlled, like everyone in the room was waiting to see how the system would respond. The president didn't answer immediately. Instead, she smiled slightly, not a friendly smile, more like a pause before correction. Then she said something I wasn't expecting. She said that even if interim members had participated in discussions or indicated opinions, their input was non-binding, and therefore their participation did not affect official votes. That sounded structured, but it didn't actually answer the question. So I followed up, calmly. If they were recorded as voting in meeting records, were those records incorrect? That's when the tone changed. Subtly, again, but noticeably. She paused longer this time, and then said something I didn't fully process at first. She said, "The records reflect the intent of the board at the time they were drafted." That sentence didn't make sense in any standard procedural framework, because minutes are supposed to record what happened, not what was intended. And before I could respond, another board member stepped in. He started talking about how administrative language can be interpreted differently depending on context. Another deflection. Another layer. Another shift away from direct accountability. But I wasn't looking at him anymore. I was looking at the stack of documents on the table, because I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A second version of the meeting minutes had been placed on top. Fresh print. Same meeting, different wording. I picked it up and immediately saw the difference. The section listing members at large had been modified. Names were the same, but the label interim had been removed in some places and added in others. Not consistently, not cleanly, like the document had been edited multiple times without a final version ever being agreed upon. That's when I understood something important. These weren't mistakes. They were layers. And then something happened that shifted the entire room. A resident in the back quietly asked if she was also considered interim. A simple question, almost harmless. The president replied immediately. Too immediately. She said yes. Everyone who had not been formally elected to the board was considered interim until official confirmation. That was new. That rule had never been mentioned before. Not in emails, not in bylaws, not in newsletters. It was being created in real time, in front of everyone. And I realized something even more disturbing. This wasn't just about the word interim. It was about the ability to redefine roles instantly, depending on what was being questioned. I looked back down at the minutes in my hands, and that's when I saw it. In the margin of the page, a handwritten note again. Different handwriting this time. Same word. Interim. But underneath it, a line I hadn't noticed before. Small, almost hidden between printed text and ink. Do not discuss during meeting. And then I looked up, across the room. The president was no longer speaking. She was watching me again. But this time, she wasn't alone. 2 other board members were also watching. Not reacting, not speaking, just observing. Like they were waiting to see how far I was willing to take this. And for the first time since I started reading those bylaws, I realized this wasn't something I had discovered. It was something I had been allowed to see. After that meeting, I stopped thinking of this as just an HOA issue. Because what I had seen wasn't just inconsistent behavior anymore. It was structured inconsistency. And that meant something was being maintained deliberately. I went home that night and did something I probably should have done earlier. I stopped relying on what the HOA was telling us and started looking at external records, official ones, county filings, articles of incorporation, public documents that were supposed to define what the HOA actually was. I assumed everything would match. That was the assumption people usually make about systems like this, that internal rules and external records are aligned. They're not supposed to contradict each other. But they did. The first document I downloaded was the Articles of Incorporation from the county website. It was supposed to be the foundation of everything the HOA operated under. Legal structure, board authority, membership rules, the base layer. I opened it, expecting confirmation. Instead, I found something I didn't understand immediately. The version online didn't match the version the HOA had been distributing internally. At first, I thought it was just formatting differences. Maybe a revision, maybe an update. But the more I compared them, the more obvious it became. This wasn't formatting. It was structural difference. Sections were missing. Clauses were rewritten. Entire paragraphs existed in one version, but not the other. But the biggest contradiction was the board structure itself. In the county filing, the membership roles were defined clearly, including the limit, 1 member at large. Just like the bylaws, consistent, reinforced, unambiguous. But the HOA documents I had received at meetings told a different story. Multiple members at large, interim positions, temporary voting roles. A structure that simply did not exist in the official filing. That's when I started asking a worse question. Not what are they doing, but which version of reality is actually being used to make decisions? I printed both versions and laid them side by side, page by page, line by line. And the differences didn't look accidental. They looked curated, selective, like someone had decided which rules would be visible internally and which ones would only exist on paper outside the organization. Then I noticed something even stranger. There was a section in the county version referencing amendments, official updates that were supposed to be filed whenever structural changes were made, but there was no matching amendment record for the changes I was seeing internally. None! Which meant one of two things. Either the HOA had changed internal governance without properly filing amendments, or the internal documents were never legally updated in the first place. Both possibilities were serious, but neither had ever been mentioned in any meeting. Not once. So I started looking deeper, and that's when I found the second inconsistency. There was a payment listed in last year's financial summary, $700, paid to an attorney. No explanation beyond legal consultation for covenant amendments. No name attached in the public summary. No breakdown of services, just a line item. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I remembered something the vice president had said during a previous meeting. He had mentioned that the amended covenants were drafted with legal assistance, and when someone asked who the attorney was, the question was avoided, not answered, redirected. So I started connecting the dots, and the picture wasn't clear yet, but it was getting heavier. Because if an attorney had been involved in drafting amendments, there should be records, contracts, invoices, names, filings, something. But there was nothing publicly traceable that matched what the HOA was claiming internally. And that created a gap between what was being presented and what should exist in any properly documented legal process. That night, I went back to the meeting minutes again, the same ones I had taken from the table, and I noticed something I had missed before. A subtle inconsistency in how roles were described across different months. Sometimes members at large were listed as voting, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they didn't appear at all. It wasn't just confusion, it was variability. And variability in governance documents is not normal. It's a signal. By the end of the night, I wasn't looking at isolated issues anymore. I was looking at a pattern. Internal rules that didn't match external filings, meeting records that changed depending on version, roles that existed without legal definition, financial entries that couldn't be fully traced. And all of it pointed to the same uncomfortable possibility, that the HOA wasn't just mismanaged, it was operating with multiple layers of documentation that didn't align with each other, which meant something even more unsettling. If you changed which document you referenced, you could change what was considered true. And that's when I realized I needed more than documents. I needed proof of how decisions were actually being made, inside the room, in real time. Because paper could be rewritten, but meetings were supposed to be harder to fake. And the next meeting was only a few days away. By the time the next meeting came around, I wasn't looking for clarification anymore. I was looking for consistency. Because by now, the inconsistencies weren't isolated. They were systematic. And systems don't behave that way by accident. This time, I didn't just bring bylaws and notes. I brought copies. Multiple versions of the same documents. County filings, HOA packets, meeting minutes, financial summaries. Everything printed, highlighted, cross-referenced. Not because I wanted to create conflict, but because I needed to be able to prove what I was seeing. The meeting started the same way as before. Controlled, structured, predictable. The president ran through the agenda like nothing had ever been questioned. But I could feel something had changed. Not in the procedures, in the atmosphere. Like everyone in the room knew I had stopped accepting explanations at face value. When financials came up, I waited. This was the part one was most interested in, because money is where systems either stay transparent or reveal how much they rely on opacity. The treasurer began by presenting the standard overview: bank balance, general expenses, maintenance costs. Everything summarized, everything simplified. Then I asked for something specific, not aggressively, just directly. I asked if the general ledger could be provided, a full breakdown of individual transactions, not summaries, actual entries. There was a pause, a noticeable one, not long enough to seem dramatic, but long enough to feel deliberate. The treasurer responded that what had been provided was standard practice. Bank statements were sufficient for transparency. The implication was clear. What I was asking for was unnecessary. But that wasn't accurate, and everyone in the room, including him, knew it.
So I asked again, calmly, if the ledger exists, can it be shared with members? Another pause, shorter this time, more controlled. He didn't say no, but he also didn't say yes. Instead, he repeated that financial summaries had always been provided in this format, as if repetition could replace explanation. That's when I noticed something physical on the table, a bank statement being held up. Not distributed, displayed, like visual proof was meant to replace documentation. I asked a follow-up question. There was a $700 payment listed to an attorney in the prior year. I asked who the attorney was. The room shifted immediately. Not loudly, not visibly, but enough that I could feel it. Like a shared awareness that this question had been asked before and avoided before. The response came quickly. Too quickly. The treasurer said it was related to legal assistance for covenant amendments. No additional details were provided. I asked again, was the attorney identified anywhere in the records? The answer didn't change. It wasn't available. Or it hadn't been retained in the documentation. The phrasing shifted slightly each time, but the result was always the same. No name, no traceable identity. And that's when the vice president stepped in. Not to clarify, but to redirect. He started talking about how legal work is often handled under general consultation agreements, how confidentiality can apply, how specifics aren't always disclosed in HOA-level reporting. It sounded plausible, which is exactly what made it effective. But plausibility without traceability is just controlled ambiguity.
Then something happened that changed the tone of the entire room. A resident asked a simple question: why the minutes from the previous meeting had been updated after distribution. The president responded immediately. She said there had been formatting corrections, minor adjustments for clarity, nothing substantive. But I had both versions in front of me, and I knew that wasn't true. I raised them, side by side. Same meeting, different wording in key sections, different descriptions of the same board roles, different classification of participation. The president didn't react immediately. Instead, she looked at the documents, not at me, at the papers, like she was assessing how visible the discrepancy actually was. Then she said something that wasn't an explanation. It was a framing. She said that meeting minutes are living documents until officially approved.
That phrase didn't exist in any procedural guideline I had read. Not in the bylaws, not in county governance references, not in any standard HOA documentation structure. And yet she said it like it was obvious, like it was always true. That was the moment I understood the real mechanism of this system. Not the rules, not the bylaws, not even the structure, but the ability to redefine interpretation after the fact. Because if minutes can change after distribution, and roles can be reclassified after participation, and votes can be retroactively interpreted as non-binding, then nothing is fixed. Everything is adjustable. And adjustable systems don't need to break rules. They just need to reinterpret them faster than people can challenge them. After that exchange, the room went quieter. Not tense, controlled again. Like the system had absorbed the challenge and stabilized itself. But I noticed something else. The stack of financial documents on the table was no longer fully visible. Some pages had been removed or rearranged. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough that I could tell someone was actively managing what was accessible in real time. And that was the most important realization so far. This wasn't passive inconsistency. It was active curation.
which meant the next step wasn't going to be about documents anymore. It was going to be about confrontation inside the structure itself. Because at some point, you stop being someone who reads the system and become someone the system has to respond to. And I could already feel that point getting closer. I knew something was different the moment I walked into the clubhouse. It wasn't the setup. Same folding chairs, same long table, same fluorescent lighting that made everything feel slightly unreal. What had changed was the people. They weren't relaxed anymore. They were prepared. There's a difference between a normal HOA meeting and an election meeting that people care about. Normal meetings are passive. Election meetings are tense. And this one felt like tension had been sitting in the room long before I arrived. I took my seat and immediately noticed the paperwork was thicker than usual. Packets stacked in multiple layers, different versions of agendas printed and corrected, and a visible effort to control what information was being emphasized. The president opened the meeting with a tone that felt more formal than usual, less conversational, more procedural. Like every word had been rehearsed not just for clarity, but for resistance. The first half of the meeting moved normally. Reports, updates, maintenance discussions. But underneath it, something else was happening. People weren't just listening. They were positioning. When nominations were opened, I stayed quiet at first. I wasn't sure if I was even going to participate. At this point, I wasn't trying to win anything. I was trying to understand what was actually happening inside the structure. But then, something unexpected happened. A neighbor nominated me. Directly. No warning, no coordination, just a name spoken out loud into the room. For a second, nothing happened. Then the president spoke. She said nominations needed to follow procedure, that candidates must be pre-registered or previously declared. It sounded official. But I had emailed asking about election procedures days earlier and never received that requirement. I pointed that out, calmly, and the room shifted immediately. Because now it wasn't just a nomination issue, it was a consistency issue. The president responded that the requirement was part of internal board guidelines, not always included in general communications. That was the first contradiction of the evening, but not the last. Another resident nominated a second candidate, this time someone who had been openly critical of the board. The vice president immediately objected. He said the candidate was not in good standing. That phrase again, not clearly defined, not consistently applied, but suddenly powerful enough to determine eligibility? The candidate responded that he had paid all outstanding dues, that he had confirmation emails, that he had attempted to resolve the issue weeks earlier. The board's response was that additional administrative review was required before reinstatement, even after payment, even after confirmation, even after documentation. And that's when I realized something important. Eligibility wasn't being determined by rules. It was being determined by interpretation of rules at the moment they were needed. The meeting continued, but the structure was starting to fracture under its own explanations. Every decision required clarification. Every clarification required reinterpretation. Every reinterpretation created new ambiguity. Then came the moment that changed everything. Voting began. Paper ballots were distributed. Folded sheets, simple markings, but the atmosphere in the room changed immediately. Because now, everything was final. No more discussion, no more deflection. Just counting. I watched carefully as ballots were collected. Not because I didn't trust the process, but because I had learned that process was exactly where inconsistencies were introduced. The counting took longer than expected. Not dramatically, but noticeably. People exchanged looks. The board members stayed unusually quiet. Then the president began announcing results, slowly, one by one. And I noticed something immediately. The numbers were extremely close. Closer than expected for a board that had been functioning without visible opposition for years. Then came the final vote. President position. There was a pause before the announcement, longer than any pause in the meeting so far. And in that pause, I realized something. This wasn't just an election. It was a control threshold. The result was announced. And for a moment, the room didn't react. Not immediately. Like, everyone was processing whether what they heard was real. Then it settled in. 10 votes to 9. Not a landslide. Not a dominance. A split. Almost perfectly divided. I looked across the room. At the president, at the board members, at the residents. And for the first time, I didn't see a controlled system. I saw a fragile one. Because systems built on interpretation don't collapse loudly. They shift quietly when the balance changes. The president spoke again, but her tone had changed. Still formal, but less certain, less absolute. The meeting concluded shortly after. Procedural closing statements, thank yous, adjournment. But nobody stood up immediately, because something had already changed in the room, even if no one was saying it out loud. As people started leaving, I noticed something subtle. The board members weren't grouping together like before. They were separated. Not physically forced, but socially fractured. And then I looked at the stack of documents one last time before leaving. The same packets, the same reports. But something felt different about them now. Less authoritative. Mere vulnerable. Because for the first time, the system hadn't controlled the outcome. It had only recorded it. And as I walked out of the clubhouse into the quiet suburban night, I realized something that hadn't fully set in yet. This wasn't over. It had just shifted phases. For the first time in years, the HOA meeting didn't end with silence that felt controlled. It ended with uncertainty. Not chaos, not resolution. Something in between. After the election, people didn't leave immediately. That alone was unusual. Normally, everyone stood up, avoided eye contact, and left as quickly as possible. This time, groups formed in small clusters, people talking quietly. Not about rules, about what just happened, about what it meant. The board members stayed seated longer than usual, not speaking, just observing, like they were recalculating what their role in the room now meant. Like the structure they had been operating inside had shifted without asking permission. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate yet. Because winning an election in a system like this doesn't automatically mean the system changes. It just means you now sit inside it. And now you are responsible for what it becomes next. After most people left, I stayed back for a few minutes. I wanted to see what would happen once the public part was over. That's when I noticed something important. The energy of the room changed completely once the residents were gone. No more performance, no more procedural tone, just people looking at documents differently, like they were no longer symbols of transparency, but tools that needed to be reinterpreted. One of the board members approached me, not aggressively, not defensively, carefully. He said we would need to review transition procedures. That wording stood out immediately, because it didn't sound like change, it sounded like containment. I asked what that meant. He didn't answer directly. He said there were administrative steps required before new roles were fully recognized. That was the first moment I understood something critical. Winning the vote was not the same as gaining authority. At least not yet. The system didn't collapse when it lost alignment. It adapted, slowly, through process, through interpretation, through delay. Over the next few days, things started shifting in small ways. Emails changed tone. Board communication became more cautious. Requests that were previously ignored suddenly received acknowledgement. Not answers, acknowledgement. And then something unexpected happened. I received a full packet of documents, more complete than anything I had been given before. Meeting minutes, financial summaries, clarified board roles, updated member lists. It looked like transparency, but it also looked like revision. Because I noticed something immediately. Some of the inconsistencies I had pointed out were no longer visible. They'd been corrected, or removed, or rewritten into alignment. Which meant one of two things. Either the system had always been capable of transparency, or it only became capable of it after being challenged. I went through everything carefully, and the pattern was still there. But now it was cleaner, more structured, less obvious. Like the system had learned how to hide friction more efficiently. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. The system hadn't been fixed, it had been forced to stabilize. A few days later, I ran into my neighbor again, the one who had originally been listed as interim. She told me something simple. She said she finally understood what her role actually was. Not because someone explained it clearly, but because everything had been reorganized after the meeting. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the confusion, the correction. Because it meant the system had always been capable of clarity. It just hadn't been required to use it. And that changed everything. I didn't move out of the neighborhood. I didn't escalate anything legally. At least, not yet. Because what I had learned wasn't just about an HOA. It was about how systems behave when no one forces them to be precise. They don't need to be completely broken. They just need to be ambiguous enough to control interpretation. And ambiguity is powerful. Because rules can be checked, but ambiguity can always be negotiated, rewritten, reframed. That night, I sat down and reviewed everything again. All the documents, all the notes, all the contradictions. And for the first time, everything felt less like chaos and more like structure that had never been properly challenged before. Then I closed the folder, and I realized something else. This wasn't just a story about an HOA. It was a story about what happens when systems rely on people not paying close enough attention. Because nothing I had seen required open corruption. It only required inconsistency that no one pushed back against. And that was the part that stayed with me the most. Not what they did, but how long it worked before anyone questioned it. As I turned off the light that night, one thought kept coming back. If nothing had changed in the rules, only in how closely they were being examined, then the system hadn't really been fixed. It had just been revealed. And now that I had seen how it worked, I couldn't unsee it. If you made it this far, subscribe for more real-scale stories about hidden systems, power dynamics, and what happens when ordinary people start asking the wrong questions in the right places.